and welcome back to our chronological Bible study, and welcome back to the Old Testament. Yeah, and I'm excited. We are going to dip our toes into Deuteronomy today, just the first part of it, but we need to do a little cleanup work on Numbers where we left. In our Bible, chapter 33 of Numbers, epoch 1500 to 1200 BC, page 192, if you have one of our Bibles that we're using. Yes, page 192. I'm not going to read all of this. You can read it for yourself. But chapter 33 starts by saying, here are the stages in the journey of the Israelites when they came out of Egypt by the visions under the leadership of Moses and Aaron. At the Lord's command, Moses recorded the stages in their journey. This is their journey by stages. And so the rest of chapter 33, all of the next page, and almost all of the next page are when they moved from here to here to here to here. It's that 40 years in the wilderness is what they have recorded here. So I only point that out to you to say that sometimes we often just say, well, the Israelites moved around in the wilderness for 40 years until they came to the promised land. Yes, that's true. However, there is a record of it, and if you can see, they didn't stay in one place. They moved and moved and moved and moved and moved. And so it talks about when Aaron was 123 years old when he died on Mount Hor. And then it goes on. It's sort of a history. I would encourage you to read it, not because you're going to get out a map and do a pin map of where they lived and what they did, but it's sort of breathtaking in the fact that in these 40 years, I didn't count them, but there are, 50 or so different places that they moved to and lived in that 40 years. And who died sort of where and when. And it's just a good history. So then you come to verse 50 of chapter 33. On the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, and the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, what will be Canaan? What do we call Canaan? The promised land. Okay. When you cross the Jordan River into Canaan, there's a great hymn, it's a Baptist hymn, but we've sung it here many times. It's one of my favorites, a great hymn. On Jordan's stormy banks I stand and look into the promised land. So it's a symbol, that hymn is a symbol to say, we're almost there, we can see it, and here's what we need to do to get there. So it's a wonderful hymn, and we'll sing it soon again. I love it. And but Jordan, stormy banks. So on the plains of Moab by the Jordan, across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, destroy all their carved images and their cast idols, and demolish all their high places. Take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have given you the land to possess. Distribute the land by lot according to your clans. To a larger group, live a larger inheritance. To a smaller group, a smaller one. Whatever falls within by lot will be theirs, distributed according to your ancestral tribes. So there are people living there. God's saying, get rid of all these sinful people so that you can live as I have instructed you to live without what? Without temptation. Because what have we seen in these first books of the Bible so far many times? The Israelites have moved into a place, and then the men run into the whores, the prostitutes, all of those sorts of people. The women do other things. They have idols. Remember, they carved the golden calf, the whole thing. So God is saying, I'm not taking a chance on you being strong enough to not fall into the trap. So you're just going to kill them all. Okay then, God. That's the way you say. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, those who you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will give you trouble in the land where you live. and then I will do to you what I plan to do to them. I think this is pretty important right here. This is important for us because what's the difference between what he did and what we do not do? I mean, think about it. We live in a land surrounded by barbs and thorns, as God would say, did say. And yet, we are not given the pass to wipe them all out.
Darn it.
I know, I'm disappointed. To kill them all, to cleanse the land. That's what it's talking about here. Cleansing, purifying the land so that you may worship me and live with me. That's what he's telling them. Why do we not have that? You've got an answer, I can tell.
Because only God knows their hearts.
Yes.
And because they can change if we
So he thought they weren't going to change, so he said kill them.
Right. He knew that. But see, we don't know
We
that.
have Jesus
We don't
now.
know that.
So we think the Democrats are going to be okay, so we're not going to kill them.
Well, there's laws against that.
Thou shalt not kill.
Yeah.
He already given it to
that
them.
one, yeah.
We can always hope that Christ will save them.
Yeah. Well, you
When-
know,
Or come again and take us.
And that's it.
they could have a change of heart.
Where there's life, there's hope.
Okay, well, okay, you all are nicer than I am. I think that we have to think in terms of remember what we talked about. Oh gosh, I need to erase all of this if it will erase. There was something we talked about that I think we need to recall about the Israelites and God and all of this. Uh-oh. I was afraid this is not gonna. So let's think about it this. We talked several times about the fact that the Israelites had what? Had no Bible. They had no written word. That's right. So, why did they not? God was still forming them. Them to do what? To honor,
believe and obey.
Honor, obey. One more.
His plan.
Yep, that's great. Oh, great. Not ready, but great. I'm glad you're right on top of it.
He said it.
One more thing.
Love. Love.
Do it.
Love God.
Yeah.
Love Him. You got it right there
Love
on the
Him.
side.
Right there.
Love God, love others, service the world. I know so much about the service the world part, but that's okay. So here's the thing. They don't have anything to go by. So remember we talked about several times about it. It seemed like God is very strict with these people. I mean, make a mistake, you're gone. You know, we talked about this a lot. However, He is trying to shape them and form them to honor, obey, and love Him. So, because they don't have this book, that's why I think that's why their rules were so strict. Let's put it that way. We have lots of history to go by, including God's Word, including the laws that came out of God's Word that are still in the courthouses today, even though they're not followed very well. We have those. We have the history of 2,100 almost years since Jesus was on, and we have the history of Jesus. We have the teachings of Jesus. We had none of that. So I think that it's my opinion that God had to work in a different way with them than He works with us. The question would be, He's worked with us and it hadn't worked very well because there are now less Christians in the world than there were. Certainly in America, less people go to church than they did in the 50s. So the church is in decline in America, is it not? I mean, does anybody believe the church isn't in decline? Of course it is. And belief in God is in decline. Too many people this morning sitting at home in their easy chairs or going to watch T-ball or doing whatever thing they do. Golf. There you go. Golf. Which is not part of God's plan, I don't think.
Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with golf in itself, except when it takes you away from honoring and loving God here in communion with Him. So anyway, if the golf courses was open at 1, it would be great. I have no problem with it. Football, it's too early. All those things. But my point is, society has corrupted itself by moving away from what we have done in the past. When we were a great nation, let me go to something you all understand clearly. In World War I and World War II, we were a great nation, a God-fearing country. And we called upon God to give us the power and the strength to overcome our adversaries, who were what? His adversaries, in theory, in practice actually. So we were a God-fearing country. Moved to Vietnam. Not so much. Moved less and moved more and more this way, this direction, these years. Not so much. Less and less and less and less. And we falter and falter more, and we're consumed by more and more sin because we have turned away from God. Aren't you glad you're here instead of somewhere else this morning?
We've also turned away from the Constitution, which was based on.
That's exactly right,
the
Brian.
understanding of God.
That's exactly correct. You're exactly correct. So, I just wanted to say that while it seems strict, and while we may long for the day when we could do some of those things, there is a difference in when we live. And here's another thing. Every moment of your life, I think this is important to know. I said it not recently, not too long ago, but every moment of your life, every day, every hour, every second, the second I just said, the second I just said, the second I just said, means we are closer to what?
He's coming again.
That's right. The return of Christ. He will come from the heavens in the east, on the clouds, the bugles, the trumpets will sound, and He will raise up the dead, and He will take those of us with Him who believe. We're closer to it every second. We don't know when it could be. It could be 500 years from now. It could be 1,000 years from now. But one thing is certain, we got more years behind us than we probably have ahead of us. That's what we say about our age. You know, I always say I've got more years behind me than I do ahead of me. Well, it's the same thing. So there's another part to it. The closer we get to the return of Christ, I would assume and think and have been taught in seminary, the closer we get to that, the less God feels the need to destroy, because it's going to be resolved a different way. The resolution will come from the return of Christ. At one time, the resolution came from Noah building an ark. Remember, he wiped out the whole world. And those people, 2 by 2 on the ark, were all that lived. That was a resolution. There have been other resolutions throughout time. But the biggest resolution of all came when what happened? Christ died on the cross and was risen. And now, the final resolution will come. Your names are in the Lamb Book of Life, and the final resolution will come at the return of Christ. Well, I got off a little bit there. Sorry about that. Well, no, I'm not sorry about that. But I got off. Now, in chapter 34, the Lord talks to Moses and says, command the Israelites to say to them, when you enter Canaan, the land that will be allotted to you as inheritance is to have these boundaries. I'm not going to go through the boundaries. It's sort of the same thing as we've done several times. So-and-so, the 12 tribes of Israel, and each tribe gets a boundary, and so forth and so on. And you know, it doesn't mean a lot to us because we don't know those boundaries. So if we had a professor up here who taught Old Testament history and geography, he could make that happen, but I don't think I'll make it happen very well. And then it talks about the towns for the Levites in chapter 35. And then it talks about the cities of refuge. What are cities of refuge?
Where the murder took place.
So when people committed murder, and mostly is what's talked about here, unless somebody has testified against them, they're not guilty. That's what it says here. Unless someone has testified, if you look over on page, look it over on page 195. Anyone who kills a person is to be put to death as a murderer only on the testimony of a witness, but no one is to be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. So they have to be somewhere and be productive. And it says, under the watchful eye, is the quote from the Bible, they come to these 6 towns of refuge, and they work and they continue their lives and they have their families, but it's sort of like being let out of jail with an ankle bracelet. It's sort of what we're talking about here. And they continue their lives, and it tells all the things about killing someone that we don't need to go into, because I don't think any of you are about to do that, or I would spend more time on it. But, thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not commit adultery are not 2 biggies in our church. So we're going to go ahead. But it says, do not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who deserves to die. They are to be put to death. It goes on and on with all these rules about murder. So that's what this is about. But remember, in those days, they had a lot more murder, percentage-wise, than we do. They had a lot more because they lived out on the plains, and how did they resolve things? With fights, with battle.
Yeah.
So they were a much more aggressive people than we are now. We've been cityfied, and so we don't have that. Except that when you read the news every day, you see all these people who kill their families and do all that. But that's a whole terrible thing. Then it talks about the inheritance of Zelophehad's daughters in chapter 36. So this is pretty interesting because they go and say, we want our own share and we want to marry. I think he had, 6 daughters. And it says, what the tribe of the descendants of Joseph is saying is right. This is what God said. This is what the Lord commands for Zelophehad's daughters. They may marry anyone they please as long as they marry within their father's tribal clan. No inheritance in Israel is to pass from one tribe to another. For every Israelite shall keep the tribal inheritance of their ancestors. Every daughter who inherits land in Israel, in any Israelite tribe, must marry someone in her father's tribe, clan, so that every Israelite will possess the inheritance of their ancestors. No inheritance may pass from one tribe to another, for each Israelite tribe is to keep the land it inherits. So Zelophehad's daughters did as the Lord commanded Moses. And then it tells who they married and whatnot. This is the end of the book of Numbers. Now, this might make some of you mad because I don't know all about your families. I know some of you about your families, but I don't know about your families. This little thing down here on chapter 36, from verse 6, let's say, down to 9 through 9, talking about staying in your tribe. A lot of people use this to talk about what?
Interracial marriage.
Yes, to let other people play. Yes, interracial marriage. They say stay within your tribe. I mean,
Well,
go ahead.
the idea of a social order that is built on tribal today is a non-starter.
Why?
Just because the population is amalgamated and
Does that make it right?
well, I didn't say it's right. I'm just saying it's
No, I'm just
not,
asking you.
tribal concepts are in the world populations are less and less, of an issue.
I think what you're saying is right, by the way. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. The question becomes, like so many things in the world today, does that mean it's right?
Morality is declining too. That doesn't make it right.
So I think Tom is right. Our society has, I love the word, amalgamated. That's great. And is exposed. Another thing is we are exposed to different people. When I was growing up, when you all were growing up, you probably didn't know too many people who weren't like you. Isn't that right?
Right.
You might have known that there were some people in my hometown of Wichita Falls, Texas, USA, 101,000 people when I was growing up. All the people who didn't like me lived across the tracks, as they used to say. Does anybody know that phrase?
Yep.
Or the barrio.
Or the barrio. That we didn't have barrio, but yes, well, I didn't live this far south,
Yeah.
so we had more of across the tracks sort of thing.
Mhm.
And I was in high school when we desegregated. That's right, desegregated. When busing came to Wichita Falls, which was quite a shock, which was interesting because the black folks had a high school, Booker T. Washington. I know you're shocked at the name of that, but they had a high school. It was air conditioned and carpeted. My high school, where my mother's father went and grandparents went, where I just went for my 50th reunion, was none of those things. It was 3 stories and hot as Hades, and it was not in any way carpeted. There was nothing carpeted about it. And so they were unhappy that they had to come to our school. I would have made a deal that they come and we go, but that's not the way it worked. That's not the federal judge. Who was the federal judge that created all this? Remember his name? 3, 2, 1. Barefoot Sanders was the judge in Dallas, Texas, who wrote the laws on segregation, desegregation. Barefoot Sanders. Just a little thing. You get that free when you have school here.
Never heard of them.
Oh, well, you're a Yankee. You wouldn't know him. But he was the one who did it in Texas.
In Texas, yeah.
Yeah, they had to do it different. But in Texas, it was Barefoot Sanders. He was a federal judge.
Okay.
And his real name was Barefoot, but that's what they called him. I don't know why. But they did that.
He was from the wrong side of the track.
Yeah, he was. He was misguided. He couldn't do his best.
He was extra liberal.
He was, yes. Yeah, George, you would remember him more than, I just remember the name and what happened. And, for a half of a year in high school, every morning, all these different tribes would be in the student union areas where you bought Cokes and things and have horrible fights. Just horrible fights. And those folks would have rings and they would have a single-edged razor blade on them, welded in there. These are our African American brothers.
Those are their shoes.
And they would catch you in the stairwell. It was horrible.
Yep.
Now I'll tell you a little bit more about it, just because I want you to know how what we do is how we think is important. So it was a mess. The police were there. It didn't help. It was just a mess. And people were scared to come to school, and mothers and fathers were pulling kids out of school. And, but this was before they had private schools so much, except, of course, the Episcopalians who had private schools since before they had the Episcopal Church. But other than that, so what happened was we had some black athletes, and the football team was really, really, really good. And they were on their way to a state championship, and they did win it that year, 1969, by the way. They won the Texas State Championship, 5A State Championship. However, the point being, they had an assembly of everybody in school, and they had the football team on the stage and the band and blah, blah, blah. And they had the captains, and there were 3 black captains and 3 white captains who were all state people. And they got up and said, "We're trying to win a state championship, the 11th one for Wichita Falls Senior High School, and y'all are distracting us with all this stuff you're doing. Can you stop it so we can come together and win a state championship?"
Stop.
Yeah, I mean, there were still, but it stopped.
Wow.
Because What was more important?
Football.
Football.
Friday Night Lights.
Friday Night Lights. You got it.
Nothing was more important.
That's how it stopped the problem of desegregation at Wichita Falls, my school. The other schools didn't have as good a football team, they couldn't play that way. But I'm just saying, but that's how it happened. I don't know why I tell you that, except to tell you that Tom is right, that but the scripture, what I'm trying to say is, we've done this several times, the scripture that the people who are against interracial relationships in marriage use is this one. This is the one they will quote when they get up to talk about it, preach about it. Yes, sir.
Well, growing up, being Polish,
Yes.
my grandmother's, when I dated a gal that wasn't Polish, she said, "Can't you find a good
Anybody
girl?"
Polish? Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
That was the last generation that,
Well, I mean, that's sort of still the way it was and is into some areas.
They make really good sausage.
That's good.
I said they make really good sausage.
Yes, and when they didn't marry within their own group, that sausage started to kind of wheedle down.
That's
It was less pure. The sausage was less pure, so to speak. So,
they didn't know how to make it.
When this country was being settled, the people settled in areas like here in Texas, the Germans settled
Right.
in
Yeah.
certain parts. The Czechs,
West Texas was Czechoslovakia.
yeah, and the Czechs over in
Fredericksburg.
East Texas, Southeast Texas, and things like that, and they kind of stayed within their
tribes.
But do you think that maybe World War One, World War Two, the Korean War had a lot to do with this interracial marriage and thing? Because they lasted so long, and the soldiers were over there so long.
I think more the issue there is more about, it seems to me, the issue there is more about bringing home wives from the countries where they were.
Right. They got married over there. And
Remember the TV show MASH?
Yeah.
And remember
Our
Klinger ended up marrying
Yeah.
whatever Sue was her name. I can't remember her first name.
Yeah.
I mean, that was not unusual to happen. However, it was sometimes difficult when they got over here to
Yes.
assimilate.
Yeah, it was.
I brought all this up not to get our political discussions whipped up, although that's okay with me too, but that's not why I did it. I did it to say, what does this all sound like that we just talked about? Just now talked about, Mark talking about it, brought it up to clearness. You all, the deacon talking about it. What does it talk about when we talk about, well, there were Czech places and there were German places and there were Polish places and there were, and there were places across the tracks. What are we talking about there? We're talking about what we hear here about people, tribes, tribalism.
Yeah.
We're talking about tribalism.
Yeah.
And my mother would have said exactly what your mother or grandmother said if I'd have come home with any, well, she didn't like anybody I came home with because I was an only child and there was nobody good enough. But she would have said, you mean in all the whole world you can't find somebody who's X, white, who's, Methodist. Yes. Who's Methodist, who's whatever, or who goes to somewhere where she knew who's a Baptist at First Baptist Wichita Falls. Even that would have been okay.
No Jewish.
But no Jewish.
Well, I had my sister's daughter was engaged to a Jewish fellow in Michigan. But the family said no.
Whose family, yours or hers? Or the Jewish fellow?
The Jewish fellow's family.
See, that happens more that way than
She
it does this way.
committed suicide.
And I'm not, oh no, I'm so sorry.
Oh my
But,
gosh.
but I'm saying this to say that there's biblical background for this. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
I want you to know when the things that we face now, this purity of trying to keep within tribes, I'm not saying that it's not hard to do. It is. I mean, and I'm not saying that everybody is a child of God and has therefore royal blood in their veins, whether they are black, brown, green. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They all are. But it is a difficult situation, and I think I was saying You blend these tribes together and you're going to have people who've been brought up a certain way under a certain tribe of Israel, and they are going to have a different view, and their parents are going to have different views, and you're going to have this. Isn't that sort of what happens? And look at John's family and what happened there. That's the most extreme thing. John, thank you for sharing that. I know that was hard, but that is extreme version of what God's talking about here. He was I think God was trying to shape them to say, stay on your own front porch.
Yeah.
And you will be with people who are brought up like you and think like you and believe like you, and the land will continue to stay in your families, and there will not be all those issues and troubles that they would have had. And we have now.
And your kids wouldn't have the issues and troubles.
That's what I'm saying. On and on and on forever. And now there's just such a blending of it that it's a mishmash. But guess what? I have a friend right now, and I'm sorry I'm taking up time, but I think this is a pretty good discussion. My friend Tom, you all have met, maybe you know him. He was a celebrant at the Mass when I was married. That's maybe one reason it was a problem. But anyway, he was he's a retired priest and a retired doctor, and he was with me. We were in seminary together, and he was chairman of the standing committee 3 different times. He was head of all the Indian reservations medical care, and he was a deputy surgeon general under C. Everett Krupp under Reagan. After he retired, he has become extremely liberal, and he writes me these long emails. I've shared them with some people, these long emails. And some of them are about his cat, Miles Austin, because he names every pet after a jazz player. Miles Austin, and he's got whatever. But and that's okay. But at some point, he talks about politics. And have you ever noticed that people who are on that more liberal side they will think it's okay for them to say whatever they'd like, but not okay for you to say whatever you'd like? Have you ever noticed that?
Talk about it.
They don't want to talk about it, and they're mad at you. So, and I'm not bringing that up to have that issue here. What I'm saying is, I have gotten to the point where I either have to ignore it, which I've done for a long time, and just respond to the parts that I want to respond to, and just for the sake of the friendship, or I can say something in a nice way, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Well, guess what? I'm now almost 69 years old, and I'm tired of it.
Yeah.
Yep.
I'm tired of it. So I'm going to tell him this week, I made up my mind, talk to friends. I'm going to tell him either don't talk about it, or talk about it and know that I'm going to come back and talk to you about it in the same way you talk to me, or we'll go different ways.
Yeah.
I'm not going to live my life holding my tongue, so to speak. Walking on eggshells. It's not right. It's not fair, and I'm not going to do it. Maybe that sounds childish, but that's not the way it is. He changed, but my point is, again, I'm going back to this. God was trying to say, live in a way that allows you to grow up and prosper with your people. And he knew what would happen when we started to do all this. And so he told them about it. We haven't learned any lessons. Look at the mess. Look at the mess. And I may be stepping on toes here with grandchildren who have different spouses, and whatever. If I've offended you, I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is.
We fought in our family the issue of cultism. Penny's sister is a Jehovah's Witness, and they do everything in their power to isolate themselves. And I think it comes from this verse or these verses. That's in their philosophy. I've represented in my career a company that was basically 100% Mormon, and that fosters that concept that you get outside the community, you're going to be tainted and
Not welcome.
and you will lose your
You're going to marry other Mormons, and you're going to have Mormon businesses, and you're going to do business with other Mormon businesses.
Right.
So I only mention that as an adjunct to what.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to it, both sides. I think there's a lot to it. However, I just wanted you to know it's another time. Now, let me just give a brief start. We only have about 5 or 6 minutes. I have a new book on the great story of Israel. So I wanted to share a little bit of things that were interesting to me as I read this. One of the things is that we're moving into Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a book basically of speeches by Moses, preparing his people to go into the promised land. That's what it is. So it's one speech after another. They're long speeches. Moses, I didn't know, was the only person. Well, let me get back to that. So memory to Israelite religion is grounded not so much in the abstract philosophical speculation as in historical events. So people in Israel didn't sit around and think about philosophy and the great things that might happen. And they lived in what had happened in his history to them. That's what they focused on. So as we go through Deuteronomy and they go into the promised land, so Israel was a storytelling people. It was mouth to ear. That was Israel. Although they had the tablets with the big 10 on them, it was a storytelling people. And it said, so then it talks about how God can be surprisingly harsh with Moses. When Moses questioned God about trying to go in, and we'll get to it in our Bible, but when Moses tried to talk to God about being able to go into the promised land after he'd been told he could not, God says, "Enough from you, never speak to me of this matter again." Then God tells Moses what seems like a touch of cruelty to go to the mount on the top of Pisgah and look all around, west, north, south, and east, that he might see the land that he will not be permitted to inhabit. About that. And then it says, what is of particular importance here, central to the Bible as well as unique about religious traditions of the world, is the revitalizing of the importance of spiritual leaders of Israel. In the Old Testament, there is simply no personage greater than Moses. As the only child of Israel who is permitted to speak to God face to face. Now, we know that God has spoken to other people. I'm about to name them. Spoken to them. But he went up to the mountain and saw God face to face. The only one in Israel's history. I want you to remember that and know that. That's why Moses carries such weight. So it says, only child of Israel permitted to speak to God face to face. He is set apart from Joshua, Samuel, David, Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hosea, or Ezekiel. And yet even this exalted man is punished and set aside when God sees fit. It is always the God who speaks that finally matters, and not the merely human vehicle chosen to convey the divine speech. Well, I just took a hit there, by the way. All ministers take a hit. Moses took a hit. People who speak for God, who give sermons, who give talks, we have to remember, I have to remember every Sunday, that pulpit is God's pulpit, not mine or yours. We had it consecrated by a bishop, you did before I came, and blessed by it and consecrated it to God. That altar is God's altar, not my altar, not your altar. That is God's altar. When I speak, I always pray silently that I realize that this is God's time, not my time. When I give a sermon, I'm speaking on God's time, not on John Onstott's time. It's important to remember that. When you're in here worshiping, you are worshiping. That's why time to time you'll hear me say, or the deacon will say, we leave this holy space or holy ground or any of those references, because it is. It's holy ground. And whatever we do in there, we do at the allowance of God and the graciousness of God, and not because we think we know best. So, yeah. So I think you should know that when I preach, I'm preaching on God's time. When we're at the altar, that's God's altar. It's all God's. And so sometimes people use that to say things that are not godly. And when they do that, God says to them what he said to Moses, enough from you. Jimmy Swaggart, you will be caught with a prostitute in New Orleans and be ruined. Or whatever happens, I'm just pointing out, when you say you are speaking for God, you better be speaking for God and not with your own agenda. Because if you have your own agenda, God will say, no.
And then I will do to you what I plan to do to them.
That's right. That's right. That's right. So this is sort of a start to Deuteronomy. I'll go into it more next Sunday, but just know that Deuteronomy is a set of speeches by Moses, the only man to ever speak to God face to face, before the people go into the promised land that he will die and not get to go into.